Imagine turning the key and feeling the entire chassis shake before a 454 big block roars to life, rattling the windows of your high school. Now, compare that to today. What does a 17-year-old get now? A silent plastic appliance that beeps if you change lanes without a permission slip and has an iPad glued to the dashboard. Thrilling, right? I'm sure the lane keep assist really gets the adrenaline pumping. But there was a time when safety features just meant holding onto the steering wheel tighter. We are going back to an era where your first car wasn't a commuter pod, it was a statement. Specifically, the battle between the Pontiac GTO and the Chevy Chevelle. These were machines that gave teenagers absolute power, literally, with zero electronic nannies to save them from their own stupidity. It sounds like madness today, handing the keys of a torque monster to a kid who just learned to shave, but it created legends. So, which of these asphalt-eating giants was the ultimate teenage dream machine, and why do they make everything on the road today look like a toy? Buckle up, because we aren't stopping for traction control. Let's transport ourselves back to a time when the air smelled of leaded gasoline and burnt rubber. A time when the high school parking lot wasn't a sea of beige, crossover SUVs that all look like melted bars of soap. Picture the scene. It is 1969. The bell rings, and the rush isn't to check a notification on a glowing screen, but to get to the parking lot. You walk past the rows of heavy metal, and there is a distinct hierarchy here. There were the beaters, the family hand-me-downs, and then there were the kings. In this concrete jungle, your status wasn't determined by how many followers you had on an app, but by what was sitting under your hood. And for a glorious window of time, two names dominated the conversation, the dreams, and the nightmares of every parent in America: the Pontiac GTO and the Chevrolet Chevelle. Now, before we dive into the nuts and bolts of the GTO, let's take a moment to appreciate just how good we had it back then compared to the tragic state of modern motoring. Today, if a teenager gets a car, it's probably some soulless plastic appliance that has more computing power than the Apollo moon lander but absolutely zero heart. It beeps if you drift an inch out of your lane, it screams at you if you don't wear a seatbelt, and the engine sounds like a vacuum cleaner struggling to suck up a penny. It's pathetic. We have traded charisma for connectivity. Back then, the car didn't connect to the internet. It connected your foot to the pavement via a mechanical linkage that vibrated with pure, unadulterated violence. There were no touch screens to distract you, just a Hurst shifter that required actual physical effort to throw from second to third. You had to drive the car, not just operate a computer that happens to have wheels. The story of the muscle car as a teenage icon really begins with a rebellion, which is fitting because that is exactly what being a teenager is all about. The Pontiac GTO is widely considered the grandfather of the muscle car era, the machine that started the arms race. But it wasn't supposed to exist. In the early 60s, General Motors had a strict corporate ban on putting engines larger than 330 cubic inches into mid-sized cars. It was a rule designed by bean counters in suits who probably drove slow sedans and hated fun. But over at Pontiac, a man named John DeLorean, yes, the guy who would later give us the time machine, decided that rules were merely suggestions. He and his engineering team looked at the mid-sized Pontiac Tempest and realized that the 389 cubic inch V8 from the full-sized Bonneville would fit right in. It was like shoving a stick of dynamite into a firecracker. It was dangerous, unnecessary, and absolutely brilliant. They found a loophole. The corporate ban applied to standard models, but DeLorean realized they could offer the big engine as an option package on the Lehmans. They called it the GTO, a name shamelessly stolen from Ferrari, which stood for Gran Turismo Omologato. It was a slap in the face to the Italian elite, basically saying, we can go just as fast as you, but we can do it with a burger in one hand and for a fraction of the price. When the GTO hit the streets in 1964, it didn't just sell, it exploded. Pontiac hoped to sell 5,000 units. By the end of the year, they had sold over 32,000. It turns out, giving young people access to massive horsepower at an affordable price was a good business strategy. Who knew? For a teenager in the 60s, the GTO was the holy grail. It wasn't just a car, it was a personality transplant. You could be the quietest kid in class, but if you rolled up in a 65 GTO with the vertically stacked headlights and the hood scoop, you were instantly the coolest person in the zip code. And let's talk about that styling for a second. The cars of that era were designed by artists using clay and passion, not by wind tunnels and pedestrian safety regulations. The GTO had hips. It had the Coke bottle shape that mimicked the curves of a woman, a design language that spoke to the primal brain. Compare that to today's cars, which are designed to be as aerodynamic as a teardrop and as exciting as a tax audit. A modern car looks like it was designed to avoid offending the wind. A GTO looked like it was designed to punch the wind in the face. Under the hood of those early GTOs lay the heart of the beast, the 389 V8. If you were lucky, or if you had worked enough summers hauling hay or pumping gas, you got the tri-power setup. 3 two-barrel Rochester carburetors sitting on top of the intake manifold. When you were cruising around town, trying to find a race or a drive-in movie, you ran on the center carb and it was relatively civilized. But when you mashed the gas pedal to the floor, the front and rear carburetors would open up, dumping massive amounts of fuel and air into the engine. The sound was a deep, guttural roar that announced your arrival 3 blocks away. It was a mechanical symphony that no synthesized engine noise from a modern speaker system could ever hope to replicate. The interior of the GTO was just as important as the exterior because that was your command center. You sat on vinyl bucket seats that offered absolutely no lateral support, meaning if you took a corner too fast, you were sliding into the passenger door. But that was part of the fun. The dashboard was often wood grain or engine-turned aluminum, featuring actual analog gauges with needles that danced as the engine revved. There was no eco mode button. There was no check engine light because if the engine wasn't working, you knew it because you were on the side of the road with the hood up, fixing it yourself with a wrench and a screwdriver. That's another thing we've lost, the bond between man and machine. You had to know your car. You had to know its quirks, how to feather the throttle on a cold morning, how to listen for a misfire. Today, kids call a tow truck if a warning light comes on. Back then, you tuned your carburetor in the school parking lot during lunch. As the 60s progressed, the GTO evolved, becoming more aggressive and more powerful. By 1967, the engine had grown to 400 cubic inches. The styling became more refined, more menacing. It was the peak of Pontiac's performance image. They marketed it with a tiger theme, telling you to put a tiger in your tank. It was brilliant marketing because it sold the feeling of untamed power. And that is what teenagers crave more than anything, power and freedom. The GTO gave them both in spades. It was a car that could burn rubber through all 4 gears, leaving a cloud of smoke that smelled like victory. It was dangerous, sure. The brakes were drums that faded after one hard stop. The steering was vague, and the tires were bias-ply skinny things that had less grip than a politician's handshake. But that danger made you feel alive. It demanded respect. You couldn't text and drive in a GTO. If you took your attention off the beast for a second, it would bite you. If you are enjoying this trip down memory lane and want to receive more stories like this one, stories about real cars from a time when driving actually meant something, please take a second to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It tells us that you appreciate the classics and want to keep the spirit of American muscle alive. Of course, the GTO couldn't hold the crown forever without a challenger. As the streets filled with Pontiacs, over at Chevrolet, they were watching. They had the Chevelle, a nice, sensible mid-sized car that your aunt might drive to church. But Chevy engineers, seeing the absolute mania that the GTO had created, realized they had all the parts in the bin to build a monster of their own. They saw the teenagers drooling over the GTOs and decided it was time to crash the party. The GTO might have started the fire, but the Chevelle was about to pour gasoline on it. The rivalry that was about to unfold would divide high schools across the country. You were either a Pontiac guy or a Chevy guy, and that allegiance ran deeper than politics or religion. But as the GTO moved into the late 60s, getting heavier and more luxurious, the Chevelle was sharpening its claws, preparing to unleash the SS396 and eventually the legendary 4x4, bringing us to the next chapter of this high-octane war. If the Pontiac GTO was the car that started the party, the Chevrolet Chevelle was the one that showed up late, kicked the door off its hinges, and drank all the punch. While the GTO had a certain air of sophistication, a gentleman's muscle car vibe with its wood-grain dashes and European-inspired name, the Chevelle was pure blue-collar aggression. It was the sledgehammer to the GTO's scalpel. By the mid to late 60s, the Chevelle SS, or Supersport, had become the ubiquitous face of American horsepower. It was everywhere. If you went to a high school football game on a Friday night in 1968, the parking lot wasn't filled with sensible hybrids that looked like aggressive eggs. It was a sea of Chevelles. They were the attainable dream, the car that a teenager could realistically work 3 summers at a construction site to buy used, or if they were incredibly lucky, convince their dad to co-sign for. Let's pause and consider the tragedy of the modern sport model. Today, if you buy a car with an S or Sport badge, what do you get? Usually, it means they painted the side mirrors black, added some red stitching to the seats, and maybe, if the manufacturer is feeling particularly generous, they remap the transmission to hold a gear for 3 seconds longer. It's a sticker package. It's a lie. Back then, the SS badge on a Chevelle was a warning label. It meant that the suspension was stiffened not for handling in the modern sense of surviving a roundabout, but to keep the rear axle from twisting itself out from under the car when you launched. It meant heavy-duty shocks, a 12-bolt rear end, and most importantly, an engine that displaced more air than a small apartment. The sweet spot for the teenage enthusiast in the late 60s was the Chevelle SS 396. This was the bread and butter of the street racing scene. The 396 cubic inch turbojet V8 was a masterpiece of cast iron violence. It came in various flavors, from a mild 325 horsepower to the solid lifter L78 rated at 375 horsepower. But here is the secret that modern car enthusiasts, obsessed with dyno sheets and decimal points, often forget. Those numbers were often fiction, and usually they were lower than reality. Today, manufacturers inflate their numbers to sell cars to people who will never drive over 70 miles per hour. Back then, they deflated numbers to trick insurance agents. That 375 horsepower Chevelle was likely pushing well over 400 at the crank. When a teenager stomped on the gas pedal of an L78 Chevelle, the experience was visceral. The front end would lift like a boat hitting a wave, the tires would scream for mercy, and the car would violently twist to the right as the torque tried to rotate the chassis around the drive shaft. It wasn't just about the engine, though. It was about the presence. The 1968 and 1969 Chevelle had a fastback profile that looked like it was moving 100 miles per hour while parked. But then came the pivot point, the moment that changed the trajectory of the muscle car war and defined the peak of the era. The year was 1970. Up until this point, General Motors had maintained that draconian rule, limiting mid-size cars to engines no larger than 400 cubic inches. It was a dam holding back a tidal wave of displacement. But for the 1970 model year, the suits at GM finally looked at the sales figures, looked at what Dodge and Plymouth were doing with their 440s and Hemis, and decided to lift the ban. The dam broke, the gloves came off, and Chevrolet unleashed the ultimate weapon, the Chevelle SS 454. This is the midpoint twist in our story, the moment where things went from fun and fast to absolutely insane. The introduction of the 454 cubic inch V8 wasn't just an upgrade, it was a declaration of war. And at the top of the food chain sat the legendary LS6 option. If you were a teenager in 1970 and you managed to get your hands on an LS6 Chevelle, you didn't just have a car, you had a nuclear deterrent. The LS6 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. Let that sink in. 500 pound-feet of torque in a car with rear drum brakes, bias-ply tires, and no stability control. Giving this car to an 18-year-old is like handing a loaded machine gun to a chimpanzee. It's going to be loud, chaotic, and someone is probably going to get hurt. But my God, it will be memorable. The 1970 Chevelle looked the part too. It was squarer, more muscular. It had racing stripes that actually meant something. But the coolest feature, the gadget that every teenager drooled over, was the cowl induction hood. Now, look at a modern car hood. It might have a fake plastic vent glued onto it that leads nowhere, purely for aesthetics. It's embarrassing. The Chevelle's cowl induction was functional theater. It had a flapper door at the base of the windshield. When you mashed the throttle, the vacuum dropped, and that little door would snap open, sucking cold, high-pressure air from the base of the windshield directly into the carburetor. You could see it happen from the driver's seat. It was the car telling you, "Okay, you asked for it, here we go." It was a mechanical interaction that made the driver feel like part of the machine, feeding the beast as it devoured the asphalt. This rivalry between the GTO and the Chevelle wasn't just about the cars, it was about the tribes. In the high school lot, the GTO guys thought they were a bit more refined. They had the Pontiac heritage, the unique tachometer on the hood, the Endura bumper that was body-colored and dent-resistant. A miracle of material science at the time. The Chevelle guys, on the other hand, didn't care about refinement. They cared about domination. The Chevelle was a brute. It was the car you heard before you saw. And because Chevys were cheaper to buy and cheaper to modify, they became the hot rodder's canvas of choice. You could walk into any auto parts store and buy speed parts for a small block or big block Chevy with the money you made bagging groceries. Try modifying a modern car on a teenager's budget today. You can't. You need a laptop? a cracked software license, and a degree in electrical engineering just to change the air intake without triggering a limp mode that shuts the car down to protect its fragile little feelings. But there was a darkness looming on the horizon, a complexity to this golden age that the teenagers of the time didn't see coming. While they were arguing over whether the Ram Air 4 GTO could take an LS6 Chevelle in the quarter mile, the forces that would destroy this era were already gathering. The insurance companies were waking up. They realized that selling 450 horsepower missiles to boys whose brains hadn't finished developing was a bad financial bet. Premiums started to skyrocket. A kid working part-time could afford the monthly payments on the car, but suddenly the insurance cost more than the car note. The government was also sharpening its knives, preparing emissions regulations that would choke these engines to death. The 1970 model year stands as the summit. It was the moment when the GTO and the Chevelle were at their absolute most powerful, most aggressive, and most culturally significant. It was the final, glorious shout before the long silence. The rivalry was intense, fueled by burning rubber and the smell of high-octane fuel. But as we look back at these two titans, we have to ask, what was it actually like to live with them every day? We romanticize the power, but we often forget the quirks, the terrifying handling, and the sheer effort it took to drive them. These weren't just fast cars, they were demanding partners. And as the 70s dragged on, the GTO and the Chevelle would take two very different paths. One would try to adapt and survive, while the other would slowly fade into a shadow of its former self, serving as a tragic reminder of what we lost. The descent from the mountain was about to begin, and it would be steep, painful, and littered with decals trying to hide the lack of horsepower. The year 1970 was the glorious, tire-smoking crescendo of the muscle car symphony, a year where excess wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. But as anyone who has ever thrown a legendary party knows, the hangover is inevitable, and when it hit the American automotive industry, it hit with the force of a freight train. For the teenagers of the early 70s, the dream was beginning to curdle. Living with these beasts on a daily basis was already a test of fortitude that modern youth couldn't possibly comprehend. Today, if a teenager's car doesn't have dual-zone climate control and a seat that massages their lower back, they think they are roughing it. Back then, climate control meant rolling down the window and driving faster. Air conditioning was an expensive option that robbed horsepower, so most GTOs and Chevelles didn't have it. You sat on black vinyl seats that absorbed the summer sun until they reached the temperature of molten lava, searing the back of your legs in a ritualistic branding that marked you as a car enthusiast. Driving a GTO or a Chevelle SS to high school wasn't like driving a modern sedan where you can steer with one finger while sipping a latte. It was a physical wrestling match. These cars had heavy clutches that built up your left leg muscle until you walked in circles. The steering, even with power assist, was vague and floaty, requiring constant micro-corrections just to stay in a straight line. And the brakes? Let's talk about the comedy that was 1960s braking technology. You had a 4,000-pound block of steel rocketing down the highway, stopped by drum brakes that were essentially 4 soup cans rubbing against some shoes. If you drove through a puddle, you had no brakes. If you braked hard once, you had brakes. If you braked hard twice, you had brake fade, which is a polite engineering term for prayer. But this taught you to look ahead. It taught you responsibility. It taught you that physics is a cruel mistress who doesn't care about your driving record. Today's cars save you from your own incompetence with automatic emergency braking. Back then, the only thing saving you was your own reflexes and the fear of denting your fender. But the real tragedy began to unfold in 1971. This is where the story takes a dark turn, a slow-motion collapse of an empire. The federal government and the insurance companies, those twin fun sponges of society, decided that teenagers having too much fun was a statistical liability. Unleaded fuel was mandated, which meant compression ratios had to drop. In the world of engines, compression is the holy squeeze that makes the bang bigger. When GM forced all their divisions to lower compression to run on low-laid gas, it was like telling a heavyweight boxer he had to fight while breathing through a coffee stirrer. The mighty Chevelle SS 454, which had just been a 450 horsepower god of thunder, saw its power ratings plummet. The GTO's 400 cubic inch V8, once a high-revving screamer, started to feel lethargic. The crisp, violent throttle response that snapped your neck back was replaced by a softer, more sluggish delivery. The tiger in the tank had been sedated. To make matters worse, the way horsepower was measured changed from gross to net. Gross horsepower was measured on a stand with no accessories, no alternator, no water pump, no exhaust system. It was the engine's theoretical maximum potential. Net horsepower was measured as installed in the car. Suddenly, numbers that were in the 300s and 400s dropped into the 200s. Psychologically, it was devastating. Imagine being a high school senior in 1972. You've spent 3 years dreaming of the car your older brother bought in 1969, only to go to the dealership and find a neutered version that cost more and went slower. It was a betrayal. It was the first time in American history that the new model was objectively worse than the old one. The GTO suffered a particularly humiliating identity crisis during these twilight years. In 1969 and 1970, the Judge was an icon. Bright carousel red paint, wild decals, a spoiler that looked like it could slice bread. It was a pop culture phenomenon. But by 1972, the GTO was no longer even a separate model. It was demoted back to an option package on the Le Mans, just like it started. But the circle of life wasn't beautiful here. It was sad. The sales tanked. The unique Endura bumper, that beautiful body-colored nose that gave the GTO its sleek look, was threatened by new federal bumper regulations that required cars to withstand a 5 mph impact without damage. This gave us the crash bumper era, where cars started wearing massive, ugly chrome girders that looked like orthodontic headgear. The gorgeous lines of the 60s were ruined by government mandates. It's a familiar story, isn't it? Bureaucracy stepping in to fix something that wasn't broken, and in the process, making everything uglier and less efficient. The Chevelle tried to hold on. The 1971 and 1972 models switched to a single headlight design, losing some of the quad headlight aggression, but they still looked muscular. However, the writing was on the wall. The heavy Chevy package was introduced, a budget version that was basically a sticker package with a small engine, a precursor to the modern sport appearance scams we see today. It was a Chevelle that looked like it could run a 13-second quarter mile, but struggled to merge onto the freeway. It was a hollow shell of the legend. Then came 1973, the year the music truly died for the A-body platform. The Chevelle was redesigned into the colonnade style. It got big, it got heavy. It had massive federally mandated bumpers and visibility-blocking pillars. The SS option was still there, but it was a ghost. You could get a station wagon with SS badges. A station wagon. The rebellion was over. The Chevelle had become a family hauler for people who had given up on life. Meanwhile, Pontiac did something unforgivable with the GTO. In 1974, in a desperate attempt to keep the name alive, they moved the GTO package to the compact Pontiac Ventura. The Ventura was essentially a Chevy Nova clone. So the mighty GTO, the car that started the entire muscle car era, the great one, ended its life as a rebadged compact car with a shaker hood slapped on top. It was like seeing a retired heavyweight champion working as a greeter at a grocery store. It was dignified only in name. The teenagers who had worshipped the 1967 GTO looked at this 1974 imposter and wept. It was a compact car trying to wear a superhero's cape, and it fooled no one. The rivalry that had defined the high school parking lots of America, the GTO versus the Chevelle, was fizzling out not because one car won, but because both were being suffocated by a changing world. The oil crisis of 1973 was the final nail in the coffin. Suddenly, gas wasn't 30 cents a gallon anymore. People were waiting in lines for hours to fill up. Owning a big block Chevelle that got 8 miles per gallon wasn't cool anymore. It was a liability. The cultural narrative shifted overnight. The muscle car, once the symbol of American freedom and teenage rebellion, was vilified as wasteful and arrogant. The Japanese compacts were arriving, efficient and reliable, but with all the charisma of a toaster oven. We were trading thunder for fuel economy, and while the planet might have breathed a sigh of relief, the soul of the American teenager died a little bit. But here is the thing about legends. They don't truly die until they are forgotten. As the new cars on the dealer lots became embarrassing shadows of their former selves, the used market for the real muscle cars, the 6470 models, began to change. They weren't just used cars anymore. They were artifacts of a lost civilization. The teenagers who couldn't afford the new, strangled cars started hunting for the survivors. The beat-up 68 Chevelle with a slipping transmission, the 66 GTO with rust in the quarter panels. These became the prizes. The rivalry didn't end. It just went underground. It moved from the showroom floor to the garage, to the late-night wrenching sessions where kids learned to bypass emissions equipment and tune carburetors to reclaim the stolen horsepower. The factory had stopped building the dream, so the teenagers had to build it themselves. And as we approach the final verdict of this duel, we have to ask, when the smoke cleared and the era officially ended, which one of these two titans actually left the greater legacy? Which one truly captured the teenage heart before the world turned beige and boring? The answer might not be as simple as horsepower figures. The dust has long since settled on the golden age of American muscle. The tire smoke has dissipated into the ozone, and the roar of the 454 big block has been replaced by the gentle, apologetic hum of electric motors and the whir of CVT transmissions that sound like a blender stuck on the puree setting. We live in an era of safety, efficiency, and connectivity, and frankly, it is incredibly boring. If you walk through a high school parking lot today, you are met with a sea of sameness. It is a graveyard of enthusiasm. You see rows of silver and white crossover SUVs, vehicles that are shaped like eggs because that is the most aerodynamic shape for a grocery getter. They are appliances. They are refrigerators with wheels. A teenager today gets into their car, presses a button, and the car boots up like a laptop. It connects to their phone, it reads their text messages out loud, and it gently nudges the steering wheel if they drift a millimeter off course. It is not driving, it is supervised transportation. It is a simulation of movement where the driver is merely a passenger with a decent view out the front window. Now, contrast that sterile, plastic existence with the reality of owning a GTO or a Chevelle in the peak of the era. These cars were not appliances. They were living, breathing entities that demanded your full attention. They vibrated. They leaked fluids that smelled of dinosaurs and progress. When you turned the key, you didn't get a digital chime, you got an explosion. You felt the ignition in your chest. The car would shake as the camshaft loped, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that told you, I am awake and I am ready to consume fuel and tires. There was a relationship there. You had to respect the machine because if you didn't, it would kill you. There was no traction control to save you from a rainy curve. There was no ABS to save you from a panic stop. It was just you, your foot, and 4,000 pounds of Detroit steel. That responsibility matured you. It taught you physics in a way that a textbook never could. You learned about friction circles and weight transfer, not because you wanted to, but because you had to keep the car on the road. So, when the smoke clears and we look back at the titans, the Pontiac GTO and the Chevrolet Chevelle, who actually won the war for the teenage soul? The answer is complex, much like the era itself. The GTO wins the battle for style and cultural impact. It was the pioneer. It was the car that made it cool to be fast. It had a swagger, a certain arrogance that the Chevelle lacked. Driving a GTO said that you knew what you were doing, that you appreciated the finer points of Pontiac engineering, the way the dashboard was laid out, the specific sound of that 389 or 400 cubic inch engine. It was the great one. It was the Fonzie of the car world, cool without trying too hard. If you pulled up to the drive-in in a 67 GTO, you didn't just arrive, you made an entrance. It was a car for the teenager who saw themselves as a bit of a rebel, a bit of an outsider who refused to conform to the boring sedan life of their parents. However, the Chevelle wins the war of brute force and ubiquity. By 1970, the Chevelle SS454 was the nuclear option. It was the sledgehammer. It didn't care about being sophisticated, it cared about winning. It was the car for the teenager who wanted to dominate the stoplight Grand Prix, pure and simple. The Chevelle was accessible, it was modifiable, and it was everywhere. It became the canvas upon which the American hot rodder painted their masterpiece. While the GTO faded away into obscurity and rebadged compacts, the Chevelle's legacy endured because it was the people's champion. It was the working-class hero that could punch way above its weight class. In the memories of those who lived it, the Chevelle is often the one that got away, the one they regret selling for $500 in 1978 because gas prices went up. But the real winner wasn't the car, it was the teenager. We have to feel a sense of pity for the youth of today. They will never know the joy of tuning a carburetor on a Saturday morning, smelling like gasoline and satisfaction. They will never know the thrill of flipping the lid on the air cleaner to hear the intake roar louder. They will never understand the bond formed by spending a weekend swapping a transmission in a driveway with your friends, communicating in grunts and curse words, only to take the car out for a test drive and feel that first perfect shift. That is a rite of passage that has been stolen by technology. We have traded connection for convenience. We have traded soul for safety. Sure, cars today are faster on paper. A modern electric sedan can accelerate faster than a 1970 Chevelle. But who cares? It does it silently, effortlessly, and without drama. It's like watching a movie on fast forward. You see the movement, but you don't feel the emotion. A Chevelle doing 0-60 in 6 seconds feels faster than a Tesla doing it in 3 seconds because the Chevelle is screaming, sliding, and fighting for grip the entire time. It is an experience, not a statistic. The legacy of the GTO and the Chevelle is a reminder that there was a time when we were allowed to be dangerous. We were allowed to take risks. We were allowed to own things that were loud, inefficient, and beautifully designed. These cars were art. Look at the fender lines of a 68 Chevelle or the nose of a 69 GTO. They were sculpted. Today's cars are designed by wind tunnels to minimize drag coefficients. They have no soul because the wind doesn't care about beauty, it only cares about efficiency. But a GTO was designed to catch the eye, to make a heart skip a beat. It was designed to be loved. And that is why 50 years later, people are still spending 6 figures to restore these cars, while nobody is going to be restoring a 2024 crossover in the year 2074. There will be no classic car shows for the appliances of today. They will be recycled into toaster ovens and nobody will shed a tear, but the GTO and the Chevelle, they will live forever. They are the ghosts in the asphalt, the echoes of a time when we were free. Every time you hear a V8 rumble in the distance, you are hearing the heartbeat of that era. It's a defiance against the silence of the modern world. It's a middle finger to the autonomous, self-driving future. It's a statement that says, I am driving this machine and I am alive. And for the teenagers of the 60s and 70s, that was the greatest gift these cars gave them. They didn't just give them transportation, they gave them an identity. They gave them a story. And in a world that is becoming increasingly generic, increasingly digital, and increasingly disconnected from the physical reality, those stories are more valuable than gold. So, the next time you see an old GTO or a Chevelle rumbling down the street, don't just look at it as an old car. Look at it as a time capsule. Look at the driver, who is probably smiling in a way that no driver of a modern car ever does. Understand that they are holding on to a piece of magic that we have collectively decided to let go of. But maybe, just maybe, if we keep telling these stories, we can keep that spark alive. We can remind the next generation that driving isn't about getting from point A to point B, it's about the journey, the sound, and the fury. If you want to keep that spirit alive, if you want to ensure that the stories of these legendary machines don't fade into the silence of the electric future, and if you want to join a community that understands that a car is more than just a battery and a touch screen, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Do it for the GTO. Do it for the Chevelle. Do it so we can keep bringing you the history that matters. Leave a like if you'd take a 454 over a battery pack any day of the week. We'll see you in the next one.